So welcome, everybody. I am Josh Mackauer. I am the director and co-founder of Stanford Biodesign here at the Stanford Musalem Center for Biodesign. This is special. This is a special evening, and I really appreciate you all being here and those that are tuning in. We're honoring, this is the last of a series of this year's honoring our fellows who have accomplished amazing things. And Todd ending with probably the largest exit in the history of biodesign is probably an appropriate ending for the season with Dr. Todd Brinton. So Todd was a 2004 to 2005 Innovation Fellow. So this is a 20-year mark right here. Physician, founder of Shockwave, which was recently acquired by J&J. Led the Innovation Fellowship for many, many years. Was a clinical professor of medicine here in cardiology, and also an adjunct for bioengineering, and is now corporate vice president and advanced technology and chief scientific officer for Edwards Lifesciences. You're going to hear about Todd's journey tonight, so I'm not going to steal the thunder, but I do want to introduce our moderator, Kate Garrett, who is also a former Innovation Fellow from the 2011-2012 vintage, and currently the co-founder and managing partner for Sonder Capital. So tonight is also a special night because this is the Innovator's Workbench event where we do remember a very dear friend to MedTech and also to biodesign and, of course, to Fogarty Innovation, Tracy Lefteroff. So I'm going to let Marga Ortigas-Wedekind give a little intro on that, and I'll be back to close us out and get us ready for the event. So here, take it away.
Thank you very much, Josh. We are honored as part of Fogarty Innovation to be here and co-host tonight's event. This presentation from the Innovator's Workbench is named, as Josh said, in memory of Tracy Lefteroff, who passed away over 10 years ago. It seems like just a couple of years ago. Tracy was a giant in our industry, and many of you may have had the privilege of working with him. And even if you did not, he left a mark on our local medtech ecosystem from which you likely benefit even today. Tracy played a seminal role in the development of our industry and rose to become global managing partner of private equity and venture capital at PwC. He was known for his remarkably insightful business counsel and was very gracious and generous with his time. He mentored many folks who were and went on to become leaders in our industry. He was the quintessential connector of people, both at the professional and personal levels. And those who worked with Tracy talked about meeting him at his table at Il Fornaio in Palo Alto, which was a hub for the medtech movers and shakers of that day. And in recognition of his impact and his memory, Fogarty Innovation hosts an annual summer internship program where college students from around the country and, frankly, the world spend a summer living the medtech startup experience. And in addition, we have the privilege of co-hosting tonight's event with Josh, his team at Stanford, and Stanford Biodesign and Wilson Sonsini. So welcome to tonight's program, the title of which hits home, since one of the core tenets Fogarty holds is that innovation is a discipline that can be taught and honed. We're very much looking forward to hearing our extraordinary guest speaker, Todd Brinton, a master innovator, talk to us about innovation as a discipline. So back to Josh.
And I'll welcome Kate and Todd to the stage. Please welcome our speakers for tonight. Thank you so much.
Now's when she gets even. Todd, I have to say I take no small amount of pleasure in this. Having been my director, I'm just gonna lean back and ask you all the tough questions for the next hour. But it is really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And over the next 45 minutes, we're gonna dive deep into the journey that made you. How did you do this? How did you get to where you are today? You are arguably at the top of the mountain in our industry. And some of the lessons that you learned from mentors that influenced your journey along the way. And because this is a biodesign event and you are kind of the embodiment of biodesign, we're going to do it in a journey of 3 stages. The identify, invent, and implement phases of your career. But I will start, for those of you, I think many of you in this room know Todd very well. For those of you that don't, I'm going to start with some stats about his career, just to introduce him and his background. So Todd has 14 years of medical training, went to Chicago Medical School, followed by residency and 3 fellowships here at Stanford. Spent over a decade as the director of the Stanford Biodesign Fellowship, where he trained 143 fellows, many of whom are here today. He's founded 3 companies, which encompass hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital that was raised, an exit of over $13 billion. He is currently a C-level executive at Edwards Lifesciences, where he manages over 400 employees directly and indirectly a team of 3,500 people. And perhaps my favorite stat is that Todd has broken his nose twice playing a very high level of water polo all the way through college.
Which is actually wrong. I've broken my nose 9 times.
Oh my God.
I've had surgery twice.
That's right, 2 septoplasties. Okay. All right, so we'll start with the first phase of your career, the identify phase. And you trained and practiced as a clinician for 2 decades, working with patients and identifying unmet needs on a daily basis. But let's go back to the very beginning. So you studied biomedical engineering in college. Why did you pick engineering as your major?
I've had this question a couple times. I didn't. My father and my grandfather were engineers, and I remember very distinctly driving after looking at colleges when I was a senior in high school, and we were driving away from UC Davis that we'd just seen, and my dad turned around to me and goes, "What are you thinking about you want to study?" I said, "I love biology and anatomy," and he goes, "Fantastic, biomedical engineering." And that's honest to God how the decision was made.
Smart man. Now, you've mentioned your father to me several times, and he gave you some really influential advice very early on in your career and life. What was that advice, and what does it mean to you?
I think both my mother and my father had a huge influence, incredible parents. And I think they embodied not the specific words, but it kind of became it over time, that doing something that mattered was really important. Having impact, that's something you could really evaluate your life with. And that at some point in your life, when you look back, hopefully you'll be able to kind of reflect on the things that you've made that are important. And that it was never about what was important, it was what was important to me. And so they gave me the flexibility, besides the biomedical engineering part, to kind of find my own path.
And do something that matters, has that changed for you over your career and lifetime, and sort of how you approach that and what it means to you, or has it stayed pretty consistent?
No, it's pretty much stayed consistent. It's kind of been for me through the ups and downs of a career, that kind of the North Star. I mean, it was kind of reflecting on when things are rough. It's the nice thing about having some ups is they're really reflective. You can be excited about it, but you appreciate the ups because you've had the downs. And a career in innovation is about the ups and downs. You hope to have some ups, but most of the time it's going to be downs. And so that for me really helped, kind of work my way through a lot of the disappointing times of kind of failing, and I failed a lot. I really embodied fail often and fail fast many times.
Okay, so you graduate biomedical engineering. What's your first job out of school, and how did you get that job?
So I was very fortunate. Again, my parents said, you need to get some real world experience. And to really understand what you want to do. And I really thought that my father was an executive at a big, huge Fortune 50 company. And he'd gone to business school, and I thought, I'll do biomedical engineering, go to business school. And so the first job I was going to be get some experience basically in the industry. And it didn't matter what industry it was. And so I went to the job board basically my 4th year of college, and he said, find an internship. And I was very fortunate to connect with a very small, actually literally 2 guys and a dog. There was 2 guys and a dog, honestly. I know that's a saying, but there was also a woman, but there was 2 guys, a woman, and a dog. A small startup that was in Sereno Valley in San Diego. And that was the first company I worked with, and it was a startup. I mean, really was a startup. I mean, it was in a small little office, had very little money. The founder was founding it out of his own money, and got the chance to do everything: file a 510(k), develop a device, do clinical work, get exposed to clinical medicine. Present to 3 Arch Partners, present to Tom Fogarty, get funded through 3 Arch Partners years before I ever had an opportunity to meet Tom again.
Okay, so you spend a few years there. What was the critical turning point that made you decide you wanted to go to med school?
It goes back to the biology and anatomy stuff. No physicians in my family. No one was around medicine at all. But I was intrigued by it. And actually, I remember my mom gave it back to me a while ago. I wrote a report like in 2nd grade, how to be a doctor. For some reason, that was something that was very interesting to me. And I thought about it multiple times through college. But I was on this path already, biomedical engineering. And so what really was the kind of the impetus for me deciding to go to medical school was a mentor. And that was a guy named Tony DeMaria, who was the chief of cardiology at UCSD. And I was fortunate enough to kind of connect with him in this startup. And I needed to do some clinical testing, and I got exposed to the cath lab. And I thought that was the coolest place on earth, by the way. I knew that's what I wanted to do. At the minute that I went to the cath lab, I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do with my life. And he's like, well, you should go to medical school. And so that was really the decision to try to go to medical school, because trying to go to medical school and going to medical school for me were very different. Mm-hmm.
So you're a Southern California guy. You leave Southern California, you go to Chicago for medical school.
Yep.
Did you like the snow?
It usually, when it snows, it's warmer. Actually, I think it warms up in Chicago when it snows. So the Windy City, it was cold. Yeah, definitely. That was a huge adjustment. So I went from growing up in Northern California. I was born in Mountain View. I was born at El Camino Hospital, but I moved away to San Luis Obispo when I was really, really young. Grew up there, went to college at UCSD, and then for some reason moved to Chicago for medical school.
But you didn't stay very long. You came back to California really quick. You did your residency and all of your fellowships here at Stanford. Tell us about, how'd you end up at Stanford?
So Stanford, it's a complicated story, but Stanford was always a dream for me. I absolutely adore this institution. I always have. I said my father and grandfather were engineers. My grandfather was actually the original Stanford Indian in the band here at Stanford. And I actually still, to this day, I had it in my office here, have the bell that he used to actually ring as the Stanford Indian when they were the Indians, not the Cardinal. And so for me, it was the dream to go to Stanford for college. I told my dad I really want to go to Stanford. He looked at me and just started laughing. He's like, you can go to UC school. We live in California. You got good grades. And so I thought, well, maybe someday something else. Then I thought of medical school, had no chance of getting a medical school at Stanford. And so the chance to come back to Stanford for internship and residency was really a big, high priority. It was kind of swinging for the fences, but luckily it worked out.
So you mentioned to me that in a lot of ways you felt like the square peg in a round hole through your medical training. Can you tell us a little bit about why did you feel different? What were those first years like here at Stanford once you finally got in?
So I was older. I was older than the traditional medical student and intern. I'd spent almost 5 years basically as an engineer, so that made things a little bit different. Had a family. I was married and my son was born right at the end of my 3rd year of medical school. I had this interest in, loved clinical medicine, but I just had this interest something else that I didn't know quite how to describe. I couldn't find it. I didn't know where it was, and I thought there's something else I wanted to do. I didn't know if it was business. I didn't know it wasn't engineering because I had that experience already. And so it just felt like something was missing. I didn't exactly have the same interest as the large majority of people I was training with.
So, and Paul Yock kind of took you under his wing when you got here. You mentioned to me that he would invite you to a lot of mixers and
Yeah,
for things.
yeah.
So tell us, did you go to those mixers?
So I remember I met Paul right when I got here. So Tony DeMaria, an incredible influence in my life, said when you get to Stanford, you need to connect with Paul Yock. And they knew each other quite well. And so I tried to get an appointment with Paul. And I think it was like you start internship at like the end of June. And I think my appointment was in October. And then Tony called Paul back and I had a meeting with him. And he said, no, you should get to meet some people. You're interested in stuff. You've been an engineer. And so he invited me to these mixers that we're having when biodesign was very early start, actually, because this was 2000 at the beginning. And I didn't show up. I really felt that I didn't belong. I was scared to go. It didn't feel comfortable to me. There was all these incredibly brilliant people from Stanford and all these incredible people from Silicon Valley, and I thought, what the hell am I going to say? So yeah, I didn't feel like I belonged.
So I think this, imposter syndrome or this fear of going and not being I experienced it at Biodesign. I think a lot of people experience it here at Stanford. What's the advice you would give to yourself, around 2000? What would you tell young Todd?
It took me a long time to figure it out, and I think even through the years I started the fellowship, I felt like I was trying to follow this guy right here, who was a fellowship director before me. Not something you want to try and do. And I felt like it was taking a long time to figure it out and to kind of put together. And so it took me probably the 15 years I was a fellowship director, 10 years, and then I finally realized one day, you know what? I need to enjoy this. I need to live it. I need to experience it, not just try and do it and be good at it. And for whatever reason, there was just something that changed for me, and all of a sudden, it made things much more enjoyable. It made things. It was fulfilling. I'd always been very. I feel like, and some people may disagree. I was a hard ass as a fellowship director, no doubt about it.
Confirmed.
But I always really big priority to me was the fellows. Each one of them, every year, who they were, the things they were going through. But I don't think that I took away the enjoyment of actually spending time and really enjoying what they were doing. I wanted to be there and be available and be able to counsel and give people, but I just wasn't embracing it as much. It took a long time. So my advice would be relax, live the journey. I had that idea that there at some point there was going to be some pinnacle that eventually I'd relax and all of a sudden be accepted or belong. And the reality is it's the journey that you have to enjoy. I mean, I take things very differently now. The challenges happen every day, and I'm sitting with the team, and we've got all sorts of projects running and a lot of money on everything else. And they're like, it's not going well. And I'm like, yep, this is the ride. This is what it is, man. So you realize that you just got to ride through it. That's just the world of innovation.
Okay, so you specialize in interventional cardiology. How did you pick that specialty?
It goes back to the first day I saw the cath lab. I thought it was just the coolest thing in the world. And what I thought was so cool was I was a first-year fellow. And this will hopefully reflect a little bit. I was typically first-year fellows never got to do intervention. So you could do diagnostic angiograms, but you never got to touch a stent or anything. And I had a patient, I was on call one night at the VA, and I saw a patient that was having a massive heart attack. And I called the attending, John Giacomini at the time, and I said, I got this patient. And I said, I really want to take him to the lab. And for whatever reason, he said, okay. And this was like 3 months into the fellowship. And I had done 1 month rotation in angiogram. And I remember in cardiology, interventional cardiology. So I ended up doing the case with him. And I remember thinking to myself, we finished the case, and actually the case went sideways. It was a really straightforward case, and it literally went sideways. And we ended up having to code the guy, get him through. And I still remember the case to this day. And as I went, he survived. And I sat back in the control room, I thought, the fact that someone would let you do this when they're at the most vulnerable place in their life, this is a gift. And that's what struck me.
So, and you're kind of touching on this, but I'm curious, what was your favorite part about being a practicing clinician?
There was lots of favorite parts, but I loved being in the cath lab. The guy I did my first angiogram with is in the room, but Bill Fearon, and I remember doing that first case. I fell in love with it, and to me, it was the patients were really what it was. I loved the fact that you were doing something that you felt was actually having impact, was doing something that mattered. And through the ups and downs of my career in trying to start companies and work on companies, what I always remembered it is that day I went back and got to do something that mattered. And it really created some balance for me. It was really, I've said this a couple times before, it created kind of a portfolio mentality. Because at one point in time, hopefully something of the multiple things I was doing was going okay. And there was some bad days in the cath lab. There are. Anybody that lives the life knows that sometimes there's bad outcomes, and those are rough. And those are times I didn't sleep, I didn't eat, and I remember almost all of them. But I also know that those things were balanced out by hopefully something that was good that was going on, that I was working on a project. So I had the benefit that most of the time clinical was going well, and that I could go home even though things were blowing up and I never thought thing was going to, and that thing that day mattered, that I had touched a patient in a way that was special.
Okay, that's a perfect transition into phase 2 of your career, the invent phase. And so you're a practicing clinician at Stanford, but this is where you became an innovator and a company founder. So just to baseline everybody, over a period of 15 years, Todd was the co-founder of Venomatrix, Bioparadox, Shockwave, and he was the chief medical officer of Kona Medical. And I know everybody wants to talk about Shockwave because it's a great story, but as you tell me frequently, you always learn more from your failures than you do from your successes.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's go through some of the failures.
Fantastic.
So Venomatrix was an early failure.
Yep, very early.
Kona, you spent a lot of time on that one.
Yeah.
And Kona raised $90 million. I know you've shared you thought it was going to be a really big winner, but ultimately it failed. And maybe just briefly, because we're going to dive in on Bioparadox, but why did Kona fail?
So Kona was doing non-invasive renal denervation. The renal denervation that Ardian and some of the people like Hansen were involved with, this was a non-invasive way to do ablation, to actually treat and ablate the nerves actually non-invasively using focused ultrasound. And it was started by a guy who I knew very well, was involved with Biodesign at the time, Mike Gertner. And so he founded the company, and he called me literally the next week and said, do you want to work with me on it? Do you want to be the CMO? Because we worked on a couple other companies together that are not on this list, that never made it even to kind of being companies, but they were projects. And it failed because the floor fell out on renal denervation. Unfortunately, Medtronic basically acquired Ardian, and they did some things that didn't execute very well, and the trial that was the pivotal trial failed. And I think at the time, if I'm correct, and I'm sure people like Casey and others know, there was almost 60 companies that were doing renal denervation. Mm-hmm. It was the thing at that time. And we thought we had something really different that would really be able to treat a large number of patients, that wouldn't require the cath lab. And it was a great team. It was a really real funded, great structured team. But ultimately it failed because the field failed at that time, and it couldn't raise money. And ultimately it couldn't raise money, we had to shut it down. And that was an important lesson.
Okay. All right, we're gonna go deeper on Bioparadox.
Okay.
So you mentioned that Mike Gertner called you for Kona. Tell us about Bioparadox. What was the company doing, and where did the idea come from?
So the idea came from Alan Mishra, who's an orthopedic surgeon here at Stanford. And he had come up with the idea of platelet-rich plasma. So platelet-rich plasma had been used for a long time for wound healing, but he came up and actually owned the intellectual property for injecting it for treatment of tendonitis. And so if any of you ever had joint treatment or whatever with PRP, that is Alan Mishra. And so we started thinking about the pathways for potentially therapy, and we felt that in the peripheral vascular space and potentially in the cardiac space, you could use PRP for regeneration of tissue. And it was my first foray into biologics, which, by the way, I'm never going to do again because they're really, really hard. It was a therapy we thought was really going someplace. But the thing I take away, I'll probably jump ahead here. The thing I took away from Bioparadox was one big positive We were funded by De Novo Ventures, so it was the first time I raised venture capital. And that's when I got to work side by side with Jay Watkins, who I said I was going to call out tonight. Jay has been an incredible influence in my life, one of the best mentors I've ever had. And he spent 2 hours as a partner, general partner at De Novo with us every single week for 4 years. And so every step of the way, every learning, every meeting we're going to have, we were meeting with J&J, he'd give us advice. He'd say, think about it this way, or why don't you ask him this question, or do this. It was like the most incredible experience in learning about strategy. The technology we knew, but we had no idea how to form a company. We had no idea how to build a company, and it was incredible learning. That company failed, like many of the things I did, really because the lesson learned was it takes more than the technology to move a company forward. We had great investors, but we didn't build a company. We kind of decided that we thought we could just build a technology and that somehow we'd flip it to somebody else. And it was a really difficult lesson to learn that if you're going to work on something, you better be ready to build it and change medicine. If someone takes you out along the way, God bless you, but you better be ready to go the distance. And we weren't ready to go the distance. We were both in practice. We were part-timers. It was a really interesting idea, but there just wasn't the team around it to be able to execute it. And that was, I think, for other reasons, there were some small reasons, but I think the fundamental reason was we were not committed to building something that actually created value.
So for the aspiring innovators that may be clinicians right now, tell us, what were you actually doing at Bioparadox? I mean, you had a full-time practice. What was your week, your month like when you were founding and contributing to this company? I mean, what did you actually do?
So for the fellows that I had in the room who have to give me a bad time, they'd be like, he fell asleep during the meeting. Now you know why. At night, we were doing cases at night. We were doing animal lab cases often down in the animal labs, basically here till sometimes 11, midnight, because that's the only time we had access to do it. We were cutting up hearts and processing tissue and measuring everything. And so I did all the animals. I did all the testing. We did a lot of the strategy, the device kind of design. Alan was a new PRP, so he knew kind of how the product and how to put it together and what the device would look like and the spec for it, but we kind of put the two things together. So in a lot of ways, I was the cardiovascular science, and he was really the PRP device, and we tried to put these two things together.
Okay. I love Jay Watkins' stories, so I'm curious if there's a meeting that you had with him or a specific piece of advice that might come to mind from those sessions that you had with him. Or anything subsequent?
I'm sure there's lots. There's so many things that I got the chance to learn from Jay, and I still get to learn from Jay today. I think the thing that a lesson I learned from Jay was, I don't think I've ever told him, we were negotiating the term sheet for Bioparadox. So De Novo was going to fund, I think, put $3.5 million into Bioparadox. And I remember negotiating the term sheet with them. And it was actually the day before the crash in 2008. And we didn't get all the way through the negotiations, and then the market crashed. And then eventually it took 6 or 7 months to get it done. But besides that, the thing I learned was I never wanted to sit on the other side of the table from Jay. And you guys think I'm kidding? He is an unbelievable negotiator. And so I learned so much from him. And I remember talking to my dad, I said, this guy is absolutely, and he said, let me tell you a lesson. The best thing you could do is take him from that side of the table and put him on your side of the table. And that's what we did. We took the term sheet, put Jay on the side of the table, and that's when I started working with Jay. And I've been working with him for the last almost 20 years.
Okay. So you mentioned that Bioparadox failed, but how far did the company get? Like, where were they in their trajectory? And when you say they failed, I mean, what happened? It just shut down, or?
Yeah, we ended up shutting it down. But we got all the way that we were negotiating a potential acquisition with J&J in November and December of, I can't remember, about 5 or 6 years into the company. We thought we had the outline of a company, and I thought, this is going to work out. This is great. This is going to be so cool. And then the holiday came, and we came back and we called them back in January, and they didn't return our phone calls. And eventually by February, and I'm sure Jay remembers this, they're like, well, we've changed our strategy. We're not interested in that anymore. And so the whole thing fell apart. We couldn't get funding. We'd done some bridges with De Novo, but there was it couldn't be bridged to somewhere else. So it needed to be with a larger entity. It needed a leadership team. It needed the management. It needed to actually have the idea of building an organization that was actually going to do the therapy. Because the therapy, by all the data we had, it worked. But that was another lesson, is just because it works doesn't mean it actually makes it.
So whether you're the founder or brought in as the CMO, you've played a CMO role in a number of companies. How do you think about the CMO role in a startup versus in a large, public company? How do the responsibilities change for that role?
So, I mean, everybody puts labels on, I don't think a CEO in a company of 3 people is the same thing as being a CEO at Edwards Lifesciences, right? A large public company. But the CMO role, I think, is different in the sense that, you're doing everything at the beginning. Everyone's doing everything. It just happened to be that you're doing more of the clinical medical stuff, and someone else is doing more of the business stuff, and someone might be doing the engineering stuff. And for me, particularly at Shockwave, I was doing the engineering stuff and the medical stuff. That's what I was focused on from the very beginning. I think when you get to a larger company, and certainly the case of our divisional senior vice presidents of medical affairs, it's all about execution. They're executing a strategy. They're executing clinical trials. They're recruiting the sites. They're building the protocols. They're thinking about the investigators. But that's the end stage to a certain extent of a clinical strategy. And what I think is incredibly valuable and what I love to do is to build a clinical strategy from the beginning. The opportunity to think of what are the steps I can take to create value, and what are the decision steps that'll lead that I may say that this isn't going to go anywhere and we got to pivot and go somewhere else or change the company or get out. And so that's the way I think about projects today, which is very different than I thought about them early.
So, and I don't think I've told you this, but you have been described to me as a brilliant clinical trial strategist. I mean, amongst the best in the business. What's important to you when you're designing a clinical trial strategy? What's your secret?
I don't think I have a secret. It's one of my favorite things to do. I think when you enjoy something and you really and you love it, I think it becomes more of a natural thing. But for me, it's not about taking the normal progression of, okay, we need to do a first in human, and then we need to do a pilot stuff, and then we need to do a pivotal trial. It's how are we going to learn? How are we going to learn the decisions to make from the very beginning? So from animal work, from tissue work, every project has a different way to create value, to make a decision whether the project's going the right direction, or to make a decision that the project is not going to work. At least with the embodiment that you have, and you need to take a different path. And that could be from tissue, it could be in vivo, it could be cadaveric work. Shockwave, I did a lot of cadaveric work, a ton of cadaveric work, and something I had never done before. And it was an experience, but it was incredibly valuable because it was the best model we had for calcified vascular disease. So you got to go to what is going to help you answer the question. And I think I said this to many fellows over the years, which is you got to be willing to ask the tough question as fast as possible. When you can answer it, most of the time we want to answer the question that we think will work because we want to continue to have success. I think the most important thing you can do is challenge the question from the very beginning. If you can do it, if you can execute it, what is the project, what is the question, or what is the test that's going to kill the project if it doesn't work? And do that first. Be more efficient with the capital that you have. And challenge the projects, and that I think has an opportunity to actually really create value, and create value in a way that actually people understand it. But there's no normal progression. Sometimes it's one thing. Sometimes you're jumping to a pivotal trial. Sometimes you're not. It's a long path to get there. It just depends on the project.
Okay. All right. So you've broached Shockwave. Let's transition to Shockwave. And I've got some stats on Shockwave for those of you who aren't familiar with the story. But Shockwave was bought by Johnson & Johnson last April for $13.1 billion. And at the time of the acquisition, there were co-founded by Todd Brinton. But at the time of the acquisition, there were 1,500 employees. nearly $1 billion in revenue projected for 2024, a gross margin of about 84%, 500,000 patients that had been treated to date on a rapidly accelerating curve. And I happen to know some early investors in the company, and by my calculation, a 118x return on the Series A. So I would say arguably one of the biggest successes in our industry. So first, congratulations to Todd, to you, and to the entire team.
Thank you.
So where did the idea come from for Shockwave?
So the idea of the problem was my experience. Shockwave started like a lot of companies start, with people getting together and talking about things that they were interested in doing. And I was actually hired, there was two guys that I ended up founding the company with, John Adams and Daniel Hawkins, that were working in an incubator up in Seattle that was funded by 3Arch and by Prospect Ventures. And it was an incubator to look at potential company, had a little bit of money, and to go find something. And so they weren't finding something about 8 months into the year that they had money. And so they suggested that I meet with them and sit down, and they said, what kind of interesting projects do you have? And I remember we met in the cafeteria here at Stanford. And I said, the biggest problem I'm facing is, I'm dealing with every day, is calcified coronary disease. I think the therapies, the treatments are inadequate, they're complicated, and the biggest thing that was struck me is every time you picked up the tool that at the time was the tool of a rotablator, the staff just hated you. Oh God, we're going to set that up, it's going to take forever. And every time it was like, which plug goes into what? And there was complications. And having to live through a couple complications a couple times, you live your N=1 experience, like I don't want to do this again. So I'm like, there's got to be a better way to do that. And so I kind of framed the problem. We sat in a discussion and said, is there a way? How would you do this? And so I think the insights were, A, how do you treat calcium medically? And that was lithotripsy. That was how you're treating kidney stones. And I think probably a more important insight, reflecting on it now, was how are we going to get that thing there into the vasculature? And the only thing I knew was that I was actually working on a project at the time that I was asked to design a trial, was what crosses, in a sense, what technology crosses almost all the time. And you could think about whether there was what we call front-end balloons, stiff, compliant, semi-compliant balloons, non-compliant balloons, cutting balloons, all these things. But most of the trials suggested that a front-end balloon, a workhorse balloon, you use the simplest, lowest profile balloon, crossed about 99% of the time. And so I said, it's got to have the behavior like this, and somehow it's got to do this. And so we put that framework together, and John Adams and Daniel Hawkins really came up with the idea of how to create lithotripsy inside a balloon. They were the core inventors. They really framed and came up with this idea of just creating a small gap junction, basically, in a balloon of fluid, ionic fluid, right? That actually could create a spark, and that spark would actually create dirty lithotripsy. And then we found a way to actually control it, that each shock was actually even, because it turns out that lithotripters are very unpredictable in the energy that they actually create, because it's very difficult to actually create the same shock multiple times. So we figured out lots of different ways to actually get consistency, so that we actually control the amount of pressure inside the balloon. So that was really how it all came together. So I framed it. It was my experience, what I was going through. I put the ideas together, what it needed to have. In a lot of ways, I created the need spec, and that's what I would say. And they kind of came up with the invention. And it was the aha moment for them. But I think it was the spec that was how to put it together that was really critically important to thinking about what was going to be something that was going to work.
And you mentioned in clinical trial design, you go after the hardest, toughest question early. Do you remember what one of the first questions you tried to answer clinically was for Shockwave?
Yeah, I mean, we went through the stages of, we had this eggshell experiment that was, we did for kind of the thing, would a shock in a balloon work? We took an eggshell, and David Auth, who founded Rotablator, which was the device to treat calcified coronary disease, was known for taking an eggshell and actually running the Rotablator over it. And so we decided we're going to actually do something different. We're going to actually put the balloon inside the eggshell, inside a fluid, and we're going to shock through that membrane that you sometimes have when you peel a boiled egg, and see if we actually can keep it intact while we crack the calcium on the outside. And we were able to do that. And so we said, I think energy will actually create what we want. It'll actually go through soft tissue, but it'll hit hard tissue. So that was kind of the feasibility of the idea. But to answer your question, everyone's biggest concern was embolization. You're either going to blow up the vessel with too much energy, and the calcium is going to go all over the place, or the calcium go downstream. And so we decided from the very beginning that the question we were going to have to answer to get more momentum on the project was we had to get to humans as fast as possible. And so we ended up buying a commercially available lithotripsy that was for actually old technology that was available from one company that was actually in the Midwest that actually created basically a single electrode lithotripter, built a balloon around it. It was a CE marked device, built a balloon around it, put it through DV, and took it into humans. We weren't building a product. We weren't building a device. We were trying to assess if the idea would actually be efficacious, but more importantly, how much potential risk was there for embolization. Went to New Zealand, ended up putting filters in all the patients and actually seeing if debris came out. And I remember every patient we did 3 patients the first trip we came back. I remember looking at those filters as we cut them out. We sent them to the lab, and I was like, there is absolutely nothing in them. We're like, yes, okay. So that was probably one of those things that everybody was worried about. We're like, we got to take care of that right off the bat.
Okay. So tell us about raising money for Shockwave early on. How easy was it, and who wrote the first checks?
Yeah. So it was really hard to raise money. It was 2008. It was not a good time to raise money, and this project was actually between Wolf Jagger and Scott Wolf, who was a prospect who had funded it, and both of them had ownership in them. And they thought, well, we're going to get another investor to put money in, and no one was looking to put into an investor into a round that was already valued, because the project was just an idea at that point. And I think the biggest part of it is no one wanted to take on a big project at that time. They said, this is going to be a run. It's going to take years, even if it works. And I don't think it's going to work. So, we went to between 30 and 40 venture groups and presented multiple times, and ultimately everybody passed. We couldn't raise a dime. No one thought either the idea would work or it was a big enough problem was the most common thing. And interestingly enough, the most common thing that most venture groups did was they called companies like Medtronic and said, do you guys think that calcified coronary disease is a problem? They said, we don't sell into that market. And so they said, we're not interested. And so it was really a latent, unmet clinical need. And it was a huge need because I talked to my colleagues, Bill, and I remember talking to Bill about it. And it was like, this is a big problem. And there wasn't a connection between recognizing the problem and coming up with solutions. And so we couldn't raise money. We raised $180,000. And I saw Tom Goff walk in here in the back of the room. Worked with us early and did a tremendous job. He was our engineer. And he and I believe his family, but my father wrote my parents, I should say, wrote the first check, which I think to this day is amazing that they did. They believed in it very much, and they said, I remember sitting down with my parents, and they said, walk us through it. Why do you think it's going to work? And I just don't know how to describe it. I said, I really think this will make a difference in medicine. I really think if we can do it, it'll work, and it could change medicine pretty dramatically. And my dad said, okay, all right. So he wrote a check. Tom and I think some family members wrote checks. We got a few other checks. We got, I think, $180,000, and we ran the company in a small office down in Sunnyvale for a year and a half. And so that's how we funded the early stages of the company.
So one of the things I find interesting about Shockwave is I've talked to several investors who said, I didn't just miss it at the beginning, I missed it again and again and again. I mean, in some cases, 4 or 5 times passing. What's your advice to the entrepreneurs in the audience who are all getting turned down constantly by investors?
Everybody falls down. The question is whether you get up. And so you got to be prepared to take rejection. It's the nature of the beast. And by the way, you're only looking for one. And now that I do and work with a venture group, the dynamics are different than you think they are. The funding cycle, what they're interested in, when they have money, when they have capital, what the structure is, the return. So it's not about your project per se. It is about your project, but sometimes it's about your project, sometimes it's about your team, and sometimes it's about where they are in their funding cycle and whether the project fits the profile of what they're looking. You might be going to a fund that doesn't have enough capital to follow on. You might be going to a fund that's like, this is not enough to move the needle even if it works. And so we went to everybody that we could possibly find. And so there was lots of people that passed on it multiple times. And I think probably the truth is it was a failure on my part to articulate the story well enough. Because I told many of you many times, which is, if they don't get it, it's your fault. It's because you didn't tell the story. You didn't actually tell the story in a way that they could understand what the value creation could be. And yes, not everyone's going to buy that for all the other things we talked about. But those people that, kind of, if they follow and they believe, I think you're then pretty far down the line. And I think, it took a while to do that. It took a while for me to figure out how to do that.
Okay, last Shockwave question before we move to Edwards. But was there any point in the trajectory of Shockwave where you thought it might fail?
All the time. I remember some moments that were some vivid moments. Early, I thought, we can't get any money, we can't get through this. We could not get a balloon. We were popping every balloon material we could have. I think Tom went through 25 different materials, and we were popping every balloon. It's not going to work. The energy is too strong. It's just not possible. And then we solved it. But probably what I distinctly remember the most, because I was driving up today when I was coming up between the VA and Stanford. I remember being on the road and turning on Page Mill Road. I remember getting a call when we were raising our Series C, and they had found a patent that was actually in Czech that supposedly read on our IP. And the group that was doing diligence was out. They were like, nope, you're not going to have free, nope, no freedom to operate. And I thought, we're dead. It's over. We can't go anywhere. We can't. This is going to kill the company. I remember distinctly writing down and driving home and thinking, I can't believe we've gotten this far, and we're not going to be able to pull it off. And ultimately, when they actually translated it to English, it didn't read the same way. And actually, we were fine. And so we raised a Series C. I remember that moment, and I also remember very distinctly 2017 when we raised a fair amount of money. And we were thinking about this, the lesson I learned at Bioparadox, how to get someone to take it. And I think and this was something I think was a flaw in our thinking, which was we were talking to companies saying it's great, it's amazing, and we weren't thinking about building it for ourselves. We were thinking about, hey, it's far enough along, strategic's going to want it, and that when they knew that, and now that I sit on the other side, I know that there is no way I'm writing a check. Because you see the kind of the dynamics of what's going on. And we made a tough decision, made some changes in the organization, brought in Doug Godshall, who had been a commercial CEO. We needed to make a change. And that change was one of the critical decisions in the company, and Doug did a fabulous job, took it public 2 years later in 2019, and obviously executed it brilliantly until it was sold this last year.
Great. Sorry, do we have to move into Q&A or we're? Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so let's move into the phase 3 implement.
Okay.
You join Edwards Lifesciences in 2019 as the chief scientific officer. It's a $40 billion public company, market cap of $40 billion. Looking back to 2019, what convinced you to transition into large company operating?
It was a lot of things. I think that Shockwave was far enough along that I couldn't have the kind of influence. It had gone public. It was going to be a different company, and it was time for me to recognize that they had a great team. They were moving on, and for me to take the next stage in my career. I loved being here at Stanford. My clinical practice was really active. I loved biodesign, but I also know that I'd been doing it for a fair amount of time. I thought things were going pretty well. I kind of had reached a point in my career that I thought that it was that pinnacle that I thought I was at. Things are going really well. I don't think things can get better. They can only get worse. So why would I want to take the risk of leaving an institution like Stanford and taking the risk of a big job to go to a company like Edwards?
Now, a lot of physicians, in my experience, tend to think that industry is profit first versus patient first. Has that been your experience moving over to industry?
At Edwards, it has not been my experience, and I'm really happy about that. part of the reason I decided to take the job at Edwards was Mike Mussallem. Mike was absolutely, when he retired 2 years ago, I had 4.5 years with him to learn from him. And he set the expectations that the patient is the center of everything you do. And money will come if you do it right. But I think that the first several years I was there, I was running a division, advanced technology. I was insulated. I was in a non-commercial business. Now I have a considerably larger role, and I really am responsible for all innovation, R&D, clinical. And I think that the way that we approach it is that we're hunting elephants. You have to go after big things that move the needle. Small projects just don't fit at a company like Edwards. They're meaningful projects. And so having the discipline, bringing the discipline that you want to change medicine because you have the resources to do so, and the commitment to do so, and not using those resources on small things that are tuck-ins or small incremental improvements in what's out there in something else. So I think that's what's been the balance between really going after big things and the responsibility that if you're in an organization that's like that, to go after big things.
So you've accomplished in every facet of a professional career. What keeps you up at night today?
And obviously we've talked about a few of these questions, but I had some time to think about it. I would say that people. When you're responsible for people, a large number of people, the tech, again, I've matured in my understanding of it's the ups and downs. It's going to happen. Things are going to fail. You're going to move on. You're going to innovate. You're going to pivot. You're going to adjust. But people, that's what keeps me up at night. And particularly, I've been very fortunate to build a really, really strong team. And I worry that every time that they're feeling satisfied, that they have the hunger that I have, and that they want to do it, and that they feel fulfilled, and that their families are doing okay, and they're because that's how you keep an organization moving. So that's honestly what keeps me up at night.
Okay. I have one last question, so get ready for Q&A. One of the many things I love about you, Todd, is that you are hungry. You are the epitome of hustle, even at this point. I mean, you are crisscrossing the globe. You are taking calls from me in the middle of the night in South America. I don't even know where you are most of the time. Why are you still so hungry? What drives you?
Same thing where we started. Do something that matters. For me, that's what it is. The chance to have impact, that's what I want my life to be about. And so I've been very fortunate. I realized, I thought about this, I've spent a third of my life at this institution. I was here for a third of my life. And I learned so much here and still have the opportunity to work with it. There's been just incredible learning, incredible challenges to grow, and hopefully everything I've learned here I'll continue to translate to things that matter.
I love that. I could go all night with my questions. I have more, but I will turn it to the audience Q&A for a few more minutes.
Don't give James the microphone.
Just a quick question. Thanks for the talk, of course, a great experience. You mentioned that once you started acquiring or at least getting the interest of strategics, that decreased the interest of VC. How did that work? Maybe I didn't catch that. You mentioned something about you had to pivot your strategy as soon as the VC saw there's interest from an acquisition or buyout or something like that.
Oh, if I misspoke, I said I think that as a strategic now, which was what I do, yeah. I think I see things very differently than I did as an entrepreneur. And entrepreneurs and organizations that are looking for the out, you can see it now. And the answer is I'm going to sit and wait because I don't have a reason to move.
Okay.
But if they're going to go and potentially they're going to go build something and they're going to build something that's going to threaten my business, or they're going to go to another strategic, and I think they're going to be successful, that motivates me. And that was something that that I've learned on being on both sides of the equation. I was joking. You can let James ask a question.
Sir, good evening. Thanks for so much inspiring talk and achievements. Sir, my question is that you built a company which went up to $1 billion in revenue and close to $13 billion in market capitalization. So at some point of time, when you get your first customer or second customer or third customer, it might have accelerated. So how you designed to handle that transition? That a company which is very small, like everybody is doing everything, what you told about the CMO doing of a 3-company CMO. So did you thought about this before starting the company? Because naturally this was your second or third company, so you might have a lot of idea. But how do you thought about it? At which stage you thought it, and what was your guidance?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think it's, I think my interpretation of the question is, I think you got to run lean as long as you possibly can. You got to stay resource constrained, and then recognize, because that's how you protect value of the existing investors and, frankly, the founding team. Then there's a time, as you said, when you see the hint that it's going to work, or you have the first clinical cases, and then the question is, how does capital help expand what I'm doing? How do I actually take advantage of that? And so I think that's the inflection point, and it's different for every project. But I think the thing is, people have this glamorous idea of what a startup is. They're like, oh, that's really cool, you have this flexibility. And I'm like, have you ever saw what startups I was at? It was like a small fridge and basically a broken chair, and it's not that glamorous, because you want to be as lean as you possibly can. Because every dollar you take, these are expensive dollars, and they're a resource, and you might not get the next round of funding. You've got to get to something that's a value creation point, a deliverable that means something to be able to get to more money. And so I want to reserve as much money as I can. What I see often is that people at the point keep that mentality way too long, and they're thinking they're saving, because there's a point in time you have to hit the inflection point where you have to go. And I think that investors see that as an opportunity, and sometimes they want to give you a lot more money than what you need too, because they see the opportunity to grow the business.
Okay, Todd. Well, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. And
thank you guys very much.
That was truly amazing. We are so proud of both of you. Seriously, thank you so much. I'm just going to, if Lauren can bring up the gifts there, we have some gifts for you guys. I'll mention a few other things. First of all, thank you so much for our sponsors tonight, Fogarty Innovation and Wilson Sonsini. If you want to come to events like this, or even see the ones that were in the past, follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Sign up on our news and events page. And a special thank you to Deja Hill, and Danny, Linda, Jill, Lauren, Antia, Susie, and Megan, who made this tonight happen. And we do have a short reception outside, but I'll just say, both of you are an inspiration. This hour went by way too fast, and I just congratulate you, Todd, on really just overcoming so many obstacles and delivering and being an inspiration for all of us. So thank you so much, and thank you, Kate, for
very much,
doing a
guys,
great job
everybody.
bringing out the story. Let's thank our speakers one more time, and thank you very much. Thank you.